Hi, everybody. Jason here. Welcome to the Tablas Creek Instagram live broadcast for this second week of September. I am going to be welcoming writer, editor, author Matt Kettmann as my guest. I'm super excited to talk with Matt. His knowledge of the Central Coast wine scene here is pretty unmatched. But while we wait for everyone to join, as I usually do, I'm going to give a quick tour of what's going on at the vineyard and the winery. The big news is that it is harvest season. So this is kind of what our crush pad looks like at the moment. It's just covered in grapes. We're maybe a quarter of the way through harvest, so we're still kind of on the early phases. We're doing a lot of work with whites. We have Vermentino in the press right there. That was this morning. We've got actually two presses going. We've also got some Catalan Rosé in the press. I'll show you first the grapes that it comes from. This is Grenache. You can see it's not super colored up. That's normal for the Grenache we use for the Catalan Rosé, and it's not a problem. A lot of it's direct pressed anyway. So I'll show you what it looks like in the press. Looks not very different from a white at this stage, and then I'll show you what it looks like in a little vial. So this is me holding that up to the outside. So there's still some solids in there. It'll drop clear as it ferments, but it's going to be light pink when we start, and we're getting there. A few other pictures of what things look like. It's important to remember that, well, most of the vineyard is still hanging fruit out there. The red grapes are looking quite ripe. I mean, this is Mourvèdre. Doesn't mean it's actually ready to pick. We're still a month out or so from this Mourvèdre. And there are some grapes, like the Counoise you see here, that aren't even fully through verasia. So I'll give you a close-up of that. I got one of those too. So you can see, I think people think of harvest as being an event at a winery, and it's really better thought of as like a continuum. Our harvest lasts roughly 2 months, starts with things like Viognier and Syrah and Vermentino, moves into like Marsanne and Grenache Blanc. That's sort of, we're right in between, on the cusp between those two stages. Then a little later, you start getting things like Grenache, and you start getting Roussanne, and then in the end, you get things like Mourvèdre and Counoise. The big news, as much as we have news at this point, is that harvest looks really high quality, but really light in quantity. We're looking at, this isn't super informative since you don't know what the normal numbers are, but this is our harvest chalkboard, and those numbers are anywhere from like 20 to 50% down from the same blocks last year. That's a big deal. We were expecting it to be down a little bit, and it's still early to know for sure if that's going to hold through for the whole harvest, but we were not expecting it to be down this much. I got a picture of Jordi Lomborg, who's our viticulturist, on the phone today, calling other potential Patalan growers to see if we could find a little more fruit. That's kind of the thing that's keeping me up at night right now is that I'm a little worried that we're going to be super, super light. Stay tuned. We'll have more. I'm going to be doing running some numbers and trying to do a little more detailed analysis in a blog I'll write before the end of the week. So if that's the kind of thing that you are interested in, check the blog. I hope to write it tomorrow. Okay, so I am going to invite Matt to join me. So again, Matt Kettmann, writer, editor, author, and a guy who's really immersed in the Central Coast wine scene. So I'm super excited to talk to him. I just sent him the request. Hey, how you doing, Matt?
So Jason, how you doing?
Doing great. Okay, sorry, quick question. So somebody's looking for a link to the blog. It's linked off of the homepage of the Tablas Creek website, tablascreek.com. So if you want to check it out, I did an early report on harvest week before last, kind of the beginnings. This will be kind of harvest at the quarter pole report that I'll write this week. Okay, sorry, Matt.
No problem.
So welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
I gave a quick intro right as I was starting out, but among the many things in your bio, you are an editor for both the Santa Barbara Independent and for the Wine Enthusiast, specializing in the Central Coast. You have a new book out. I want to talk about all of that stuff. But I'd like to start by just sort of asking, how did you get into wine? What was the starting point?
Well, I like to say I went to UCSB, so I was good at drinking things, just to start with. But really, it kind of happened right after. Of course, my gardener's going by right now. Hopefully, you can't hear the blower, but
I can. I can only hear you.
Okay, perfect. It happened kind of right after college. I had studied anthropology at UCSB, and then I was did a minor in professional writing. So I started working at the Santa Barbara Independent right out of college, and some of the early assignments were, I was kind of a general assignment kind of guy, and I started, one of the first things I did back in 2000 was go hang out with Rick Longoria and learn about wine from him and a little bit from Sunstone on that same article. And so that was kind of piquing my interest. And then, just living in Santa Barbara in your early 20s with this wine industry just really starting to pop, it was kind of the things that's what you do on weekends. You actually go to tasting rooms and hang out, which I don't really do that much anymore because it's my work at this point. But, that's what we did. We would go out and drive around and sometimes rent limos or whatever and go check out tasting rooms. And so as a journalist, it just got more and more part of what I did until it's become most of what I do now. So it was kind of a long evolution, but it's a pretty cool job to have. So I can't complain too much.
Did you have a wine that was for you like an epiphany wine that was the first time you took it? You paid attention to wine in a serious way?
There was this one. I'll tell you what it is. It's not like something from Burgundy or Chateauneuf or something crazy like that. But I was actually. This is probably 03, 04. It's right when they're about to do the Wine and Fire event for the Santa Rita Hills, which is their annual thing. And I was out there interviewing some people, and I was tasting actually at Foley Estates of all places, and it wasn't Pinot Noir. It was actually a Syrah. But I read the tasting note, and it said notes of cracked pepper. And then I smelled it, and I was like, no kidding. This isn't all completely made up. There's actually pepper there, and there was pepper on the palate. And so I love Pinot, but Cool Climate Syrah has always kind of been one of my favorite grapes, in part because of that. But it also really opened my eyes to the fact that those tasting notes were serious. They weren't just one person's interpretation of a wine, which they inevitably are to some extent too. And I have to do them all the time, so I probably know that better than most. But that was kind of an eye-opening moment for me, where the veil of the bullshit veil, I guess, was peeled back a little bit, and I was like, wow. There's some legitimacy here that wasn't just all smoke and mirrors. So that was, I think, as a journalist who was interested in, telling true stories, that kind of filled in another gap. And I've always been interested, a lot more in the, I love the wine, but I've been interested in the people and the places that make the wine. That's always been kind of what's driven me a little bit more than the actual tasting. But, this having that component fall into kind of the truth category was helpful for me to kind of continue pursuing it as a career, I guess.
I feel like you're just the range of things that you write about in wine is broader than most. I had Erin Brooks on a month or two ago, and what she really does, she writes reviews.
Yeah.
I've had writers on who write. I've had Eric Asimov on who he basically writes stories.
Yeah.
You have a sort of a piece of what you do for the wine enthusiast, where reviews are a big chunk of what you do, and there is also some story pieces. Then you have the Santa Barbara Independent, where it's mostly stories, and then you launched into a third different sort of thing by publishing a book. When you are approaching a winery, how are you thinking about it? Do you have a very different approach when you're there to write tasting notes and score things versus writing articles versus trying to synthesize larger storylines for something like a book?
As you can tell by your question, it's a fairly complex formula that I engage with at each place. And honestly, so it's kind of multi-pronged, right? So when I'm in Santa Barbara and visiting wineries here, it's almost always doing both things. So whenever I visit a winery, one of the things I'm doing is to meet a Central Coast winery, which is the ones I review. So as I'm meeting with them to better understand their process, I'll taste with them. I have to blind taste to review, but I'm happy to taste with people. I've tasted with you before, just to have a better understanding of what you're doing. You know, naturally, even though we blind taste, it often leads to better scores just because I have a better understanding of what's being done and what people are trying to do. So that's a big part of it. And we're paid like this ambassadorial fee. It's not a ton of money, but it kind of tries to cover some of this work that we do that's not otherwise immediately compensated, you know, because we're paid per review. But if I'm going to you, usually you've already sent me wines anyway, so there's not like additional compensation for going to visit you. So that's when I'm visiting people around the Central Coast. Now, if I'm visiting people, and I'm also taking notes, I'm surrounded by notebooks right now. I'm taking notes as well for potential future stories. So, you know, we're always, we're contributing editors, but we're essentially freelancers, right? So we're constantly trying to pitch stories about our regions that we're also competing with, frankly, other freelancers who are now also pitching stories into our regions, which can get a little confusing. But we're gathering these stories, and we pitch features every year and all that sort of thing. So I'm kind of doing everything. When I'm doing it in Santa Barbara, because I write for the Independent, I'm almost always taking notes to write a story as well. So I'll typically do, especially if I haven't written about you, I'll typically do a story for the paper on top of any of this background information I'm getting about just for your winemaking and your wine style and that sort of thing. The book thing was a whole different animal that when we started that project, I thought, oh, this will be easy. I've already written all these stories. Because the book's Vines and Vision, the winemakers of Santa Barbara County. So it was all these Santa Barbara people, most of whom I had written about in one capacity or another. When I went in to actually go look at those old stories, I started to realize that they were all newspaper stories that kind of have, a relevant topical angle for that time of year or whatever was happening. And then I would have, a decent amount of the biographical info that ended up becoming a core of the book, but I pretty much had to re-interview everybody. And there's like almost 100 winemakers in that book. So, those I mostly did on the phone, because on the phone I can get I can take notes better. It's a little bit more focused interview than when you're hanging out with people, which gives you great color, but my notes, you can't see these, but if you could, you couldn't read them anyway. They're hard to read. So it's all kind of multi-pronged. The frustrating aspect is that I would like to do, I just spent like a week in Monterey and I had a bunch of great notes, but I don't, immediately have a way to tell those stories, even though I have basically the most cutting edge on the reporting right now up there. But either the magazine doesn't immediately want it. I just don't have another outlet for it. So, so I don't know. It's a very complicated answer to a complicated question, but I'm trying to do everything at once, essentially. So, and it is confusing to winemakers. They'll ask me like, well, what are you doing here? And I'm like, I don't know. I'm like, a lot of it's catching up with people I just haven't seen in a while, especially recently. The best feedback I had from Monterey was one winemaker, Dennis Hoey at Odonata, is a great guy. He was like, so what are you doing? I'm like, I don't know. I'm taking notes. Maybe we'll do some stories later, in background. He's like, oh, he's like, that's great. He's like, you know what? I always learn a lot when you come to visit. So that's good. So I'm like, okay, well, at least I'm bringing some value to them too. I'm not just wasting their time. So.
So there was a question that came through, which was one of the things I was going to ask you also, which was like, are there wine books that inspired you as you were getting started on yours?
I've read a lot of wine books, although I don't think the one I wrote was anything like the other ones. Ours is really, ours is actually pretty unique in that it's essentially a regional portrait, right? But they're pretty in-depth stories. So a lot of the regional portraits you get are kind of like, they quickly run through a region, or they just focus on the history. And I'm sure there are exceptions to that, but this was like a fairly in-depth regional focus that focused a lot more on the people and the places than the wine. We like to kind of say it's a wine book that wasn't really about wine that much. Obviously there's wine in there. There's a lot of pictures of grapes and of processes and things like that, but a lot of the stories really don't have that much to do with wine. The wine books I like to read are the kind of more narrative-driven ones that are about, things that happen. There's a whole Rudy story, that one. There's a really great book about that. There's the Thomas Jefferson book, that's about that old wine and that whole story. And so I liked reading those, but those weren't the storylines that I had. Adventures on the Wine Route, the Kermit Lynch I think one of my favorite wine books, if not just favorite books ever. And it'd be fun to emulate a book like that one day. And so sometimes when I'm taking these notes, like in Monterey the other week, like, I'm also thinking of that too. Like, it'd be fun to have kind of a travel log thing, at some point, that you're really kind of rolling through the whole Central Coast, seeing interesting people, then also having kind of fun adventures along the way. So yeah, so I mean that's good. And I'm looking at my thing. I mean, that Noble Rot book that just came out was a solid book. Kind of tried to emulate a Kermit Lynch sort of thing. So yeah, but there wasn't like we didn't go to a book and say let's try to do this one.
Right.
If we anything, we looked at books and we said let's not do that one.
Cool. So when do you have a favorite kind of writing to do? Like, of the different things that you've done, do you have one that you really look forward to?
I mean, yeah, I think, as much as it can be kind of a harder workload to do in-depth reporting on stories, whether it's wine or something else that requires me interviewing 10 to 15 people and then synthesizing all that into a finished product. I mean, there's this great line, I don't know if it was Mark Twain or who said it, but it's like, people ask you, do you like writing? You say, well, no, I like having written. And the stories that you do when you do that whole process and you have this end result that's like, as best as you can tell, the most authoritative story written on a particular topic at that point in time, those are the stories I'm most proud about. And those are the ones I like to do. Honestly, we don't do a lot of those types of stories at Wine Enthusiast. I do them at the Independent, but they're not always related to wine. They're always they're often related to other things. A lot of food, though. I did one recently on purple urchins and that whole situation. I did one on regenerative farming recently about a ranch that was purchased here and interviewed people around the country about it. So for that like moment in time, it was one of the more authoritative pieces on that movement. I'm in the middle of one right now about Fringe Coffee, which is a farmer up here in Goleta who I've known for like 10 years, is like going big with growing coffee in California. And so this morning I interviewed a woman who's been a coffee cupper since the 80s. And so we're talking about cupping coffee, which was fascinating because almost everything she was saying, you could almost interchange wine with the coffee part, and it would have been the same, it would have been very relevant. And I've interviewed people around the country for that story. So I have like 12,000 words of notes for that story now, which needs to be boiled down to like a 3,000 word story. So they're more daunting, but they're the ones that you feel most proud of. And they're the most fun. Like, if you do have fun in writing, they're kind of the most fun to put that puzzle together. I mean, writing is really like a puzzle. Even short pieces are essentially a puzzle, right? You have these pieces of information. You need to weave them in some cohesive way that hopefully is readable and engaging. And it's a lot of it is just pulling puzzle parts in some order. And so when you have a bigger puzzle, I mean, it's probably just like solving a jigsaw puzzle. You feel a little bit more stoked when you're done with the huge one than you are when you did the little one with your kids that has 10 pieces in it.
Though I often find, I mean, I'll write something almost every week for our blog, and I often find that like having a word constraint is often harder than not. I mean, it's not like it's easier to write a really good 1,000-word piece than it is to write a really good 3,000-word piece. In a lot of ways, it's harder because like you have to distill down what you're saying into fewer words. So I think that's often even more impressive. People think it's easier to write fewer words, but it's not always true.
It's not. It is. I mean, I totally agree. It's often much harder. And as a freelancer, sometimes you're like, well, and you get paid by the word, right? So they say, hey, we'll pay you this for 600 words. When you get it to 1,000 words, you're like, hey, if it's just a money thing, just run the long piece and just pay me the same because I don't want to cut it. And then sometimes you are, word constraints, if they're not based on, sometimes word constraints are based on a print product that can only fit 600 words. Sometimes if you're writing for the web, which is increasingly more common and paying similar, if not the same rates, the constraints are just basically the budget. So they'll tell you, hey, we'll pay you X for 600 words. And then you tell them you get it down to 1,000 words and you're like, look, at this point, I'm going to start cutting out information because there's a difference between cutting something for content and style without losing information versus like at some point you actually start cutting out information from a story. And so often I'll be like, hey, look, I don't, the rate's fine. I'd rather have a good, I'd rather have a story out there with my name on it that I'm proud of and that's thorough than one that I just got paid X per word just because that was what the budget was. And so I often will just kind of make those deals like, hey, I don't care. I'd rather have my name attached to something that's, fully there versus something that, that's not. So it's not like
And
you're
if
going
it's
to
if
go
it's
sell that story somewhere else anyway, the half that you cut out.
and the idea, I think, is that like the per word rate is supposed to be a proxy for the amount of work that's involved.
Yeah.
And if it's actually more work to turn it from 1,000 words down to 600 words, and you're not as happy with the result, like I totally get that. It makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. Yeah. And it is a funny thing that it has always been that way, that it's like, it's supposed to indicate amount of time, but sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. It's just, like any sort of payment scheme, there's ups and downs to how that works, but yeah.
So, how do you define the central? How does the wine enthusiast define the Central Coast in terms of your beat?
Um, Central Coast is defined oddly by everyone, it seems like, because technically the Central Coast includes like Livermore, um, which is odd. So for the purposes of the magazine, we define the Central Coast for me as essentially everything south of the Bay Area and south, not including the East Bay. Although I will say, occasionally I get a wine submitted from an appellation called the San Francisco Bay Area, which is basically all uh, bay-facing mountains below a certain, especially on the Santa Cruz mountainside, below a certain elevation. So I will get occasionally, very occasionally, once a year or so, these East Bay wines that are grown in like Hayward or something like that. So that's kind of interesting. But then we also include the Santa Cruz Mountains in the Central Coast, which technically, I learned this not that long ago. Technically, the Santa Cruz Mountains are not in the Central Coast. They're actually, when they formed the Santa Cruz Mountains, they explicitly kept themselves out of the Central Coast or something like that.
Huh.
But for all intents and purposes, everything there more or less functions similarly to Central Coast. So for my purposes, I think of everything. I basically think of Santa Cruz Mountains and to Santa Barbara, and then I also review Southern California. So I do, which is mostly Temecula, a little bit of Malibu, a little bit of San Diego, a little bit of LA most recently. So yeah, I don't know. It's kind of a broad. It's both a broader and a more defined definition than what the technical Central Coast is. So.
And so, of those regions, is there one or two that you feel like, I don't know, sort of not getting the, like, under the radar, that you feel like you're seeing stuff there that maybe people should take a harder look at?
I mean, I think it's hard for me to tell. Like I don't. It's like I'm such in the middle of the fishbowl. It's sometimes hard for me to see
Right.
what people aren't seeing or not. I think, I mean, Santa Cruz Mountains has been, very well respected for a long time, but I think that like some of the Chardonnay I'm getting out of there and the Pinot, but really the Chardonnay is like some of the best wine I've ever tasted out anywhere on the planet. It's
Yeah.
like phenomenal. And I think people get that. I know other people in the industry are getting that. So we'll see how that translates to other people. I'm really excited about, I mean, for you guys, all the different rounds that you're coming out, all these different grapes, I think those are going to be a real key to the future. And I think people are tuning into that. But again, it's kind of like Santa Cruz Mountains. There's not a lot being made up there. You're not making a ton of your weird Rhone grapes, so there's just enough for people to kind of get a taste. But I think that's important. I really think the Slow Coast, when they finally ever approve that appellation, is going to be pretty exciting for people. I really like what Stolo's been doing for a long time. And I saw that Nicole is leaving there actually, and Raj is coming in, so that'll be interesting to see.
That will be interesting. I saw the same thing.
Yeah, and then and I was just hanging out up at York Mountain with Anthony Yunt and some of the folks up there. That's cool, because it's a slightly cooler than parts of Paso, so it'll be fun to see what happens out there. Santa Barbara has a lot of interesting things going on. I don't know, there's just a lot of cool stuff happening all over the place, to be honest. But as far as overlook, not really. I mean, I think Santa Cruz Mountains could use, it's probably too small to start to break up into smaller appellations, but I think that would be helpful for people understanding it because they're pretty different situations. Because you get stuff from, basically the hotter inland side, that's warm, and then you get stuff from like Corralitos down by Watsonville, which is like sitting in the fog all day long. So they're drastically different wines. They're all very good, but it's it's a little confusing, I think. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, I can go on and on with this this question. Monterey's
Yeah.
got some fun stuff. I mean, Chalone. I was just up in Chalone. There's a lot more renewed interest up there. Kind of fortunately or unfortunately, a lot of it's from like Sonoma folks or Napa folks that come down and buy grapes, and then we never see the wines again. Like they don't submit to me. You don't really see them in restaurants down here. That's kind of cool. There's some renewed energy in Carmel Valley that's kind of exciting. A fairly historic region that's been kind of overlooked for a while. But again, there's like 24 tasting rooms in Carmel Valley, so you can't say it's overlooked because there's a lot of tourism activity there.
Right. But it's not. I think it gets sort of swallowed up by the larger Monterey appellation, which is, or the Santa
Lucia Highlands.
Yeah, Santa Lucia Highlands.
Yeah,
Not Santa Rita. Santa Lucia Highlands.
Yeah.
Where there's just a lot more vineyard acreage in there. And I'm happy you called out the Santa Cruz Mountains. I've felt for a long time like that is, it's never going to be a huge appellation because there's just not much land available to plant, and the land is so expensive and so valuable for houses that you're going to always have a lot of that kind of competition. But in terms of the quality of what can be made there, it is absolutely world class.
Yeah, and they have a very defined, and it's not always my favorite, I appreciate it, but like a very defined style of Cabernet up there, of their Bordeaux up there, which is really pretty like, redwoody to like, there's like this woody character to it. I think, some of them use American oak, and but it's often I can pull it out in a blind flight. I'm like, oh, there's the Santa Cruz Cab, because you can tell that it's a very savory quality. And I think that's cool because it's unique, and there's just like a terroir aspect there that seems real,
Yep. There was a quick question that came through saying somebody was heading to Temecula this weekend and asking if you had any recommendations for wineries to visit.
So Robert Renzoni does a fantastic job down there. The wines are solid. He also has a great, most of the places down there have a hospitality option too. That's kind of like one of their main games. But they have great like Italian food, Italian like deli type stuff. And again, the wines are solid. Hart Family Wines, which is one of the original people down there, they're still making, pretty solid wines. Interesting stuff. They've pulled some stuff off of some of the Native American reservations down there, some old Mission grape they've turned into Angelica, which is always cool. They make some lighter, fresher wines. I think, I tasted a lot from down there, and the wines that seem to do the best are kind of those warmer weather varieties from Old World. So like a bunch of Italian stuff seems to do all right. Some of the Grenaches, like this Spanish style Grenaches, seem to work. Petit Syrah seems to thrive. Tempranillo is solid. And Syrah works too, here and there. There's still, to be honest, there's a lot of variable wines I get from there. Some are not super hot, but there's more and more focus to quality, I think. So I'm going down there in about a month or so to go tour some spots. I haven't been down in a couple of years, so I think I'm going to give a talk too. So we'll see.
I feel like it's one of those. This is true in a lot of emerging regions. Is that there are people who have planted what they think their customers want to buy. And only gradually do you have kind of that evolution to people realizing, oh, no, actually, this set of things is what's really great here. Right. So, and I think that's particularly that regions which have a big drive market are particularly susceptible to that. And I think that's one of the things which has kind of held Temecula back over the years, is that like they've got people driving there from Orange County or San Diego who really love Chardonnay. So they're planting Chardonnay, even though that's not the climate doesn't really suggest that.
Right. And it's an interesting economic issue because, according to them, they constantly sell out every vintage. So what's the impetus to spend more money to make the same amount? And they sell those wines sometimes for $100 plus,
Right.
So it's this weird, economic situation where what's the value of spending more on farming or spending more on the wineries? And certainly people are doing it there. And it's fun to see people do some kind of experimental, almost natural wine leaning stuff down there. That's like just trying to kind of press the boundaries and attract different consumers. Because I think when you start to do those experiments, you start to hit on things. You're like, oh, maybe this isn't exactly what we want to do, but like there's some freshness angle there that we can use in our other wines or whatever. So it's fun to see that experimentation. I don't need more wine sent to my house because I have enough more than I can handle anyway. But I do wish some other wineries down there sent me stuff. I get like there's maybe 5 that send me stuff regularly, and some of them are good and some of them are kind of hit and miss. But it's hard for me to have a real firm grasp of what's going on down there when I'm only getting a handful regularly submitting.
Right. Cool. So do you have any interesting like new projects in the work, new books, new things that you can preview here?
What do I have? Macduff Everton is the photographer I did the book with. We're constantly batting around ideas for a book. I was thinking Monterey would actually make kind of there's some similarities to how we did it here. I mean, Paso almost has too many people for us to like boil down into something. That's the only reason we've kind of not done that. It's also, you've had some books done about you.
Yeah,
recently.
the winemakers book that Julia Perez
right
did.
here. Yeah.
That was pretty cool. Pretty comprehensive for what it was.
Pretty comprehensive, yeah. So it's hard to follow up something like that right away. But I mean, really, I'm trying to work a little less, which is, it's been like with COVID, right before COVID, I had a fairly decent balance between, even with the book project, kind of a balance between what I did at the newspaper, how the wine magazine was going, and then even the book thing. And then with COVID, it was like, first of all, I started getting way more wine submissions. It kind of became a lot more like all hands on deck at the paper. We had some kind of staff trimming, and so some of us had to step up, even more. And then like we jammed through that, and then you're like, okay, where's the release? And you're like, no, now it's actually, there's more ads and there's more work to be doing again. It's like, well, there hasn't been a break, which is kind of getting annoying. So I am going to Utah on Friday to go river rafting, so that'll be cool. That's like some sort of break. But yeah, I don't know. I have a bunch of stories that I've reported that I just haven't had time to write about. Part of it's like finding an outlet who'll want to buy those stories, because I can't really afford to work for free. But I have some other book ideas too that might not be wine related. Like I've thought about doing one that actually is about, I've written a lot over the years about different types of agriculture around the region that's kind of more fringe, like this coffee project I've written about, some fishing stuff I've written about here and there. A lot of it has kind of an environmental overlap. And I've thought, probably naively, I could go just grab those old articles, brush them off, and put them together into a book, But again, it's more about like finding someone to support that, first. So, but when I'm working like constantly, it's hard to really kind of step back and do that sort of thing. So, of
course,
I don't know if we'll make any wine this year. We made some wine last year. We made a Syrah from Alisos Canyon that we cut with some Grenache from the Kiama Valley because the Syrah was really ripe. Grenache was not ripe, so it seemed to work out all right. So I do a little bit of wine here and there. I don't know if we're gonna do it this year or not. Other than that, just trying to be a decent father and keep the boat floating in the right direction. So
awesome. Cool. Well, it has been a half hour, which is amazing. Seriously, I could sit here and talk with you for the rest of the afternoon, but yeah. I imagine you probably have other things to do. Meanwhile, if people want to find your work or follow you, what's the best way for them to do that?
I should build my own website back up. That would be a good project. There is a Kettmann.com, but it's super out of date. The book's at vinesandvisionsb.com. There's not many copies left, but there's a few. And then I just tell people to go to, if you go to mattkettmann.com, I think there's click-throughs on the first page they go to my independent like story roundups and then my wine enthusiast stuff too. And then I'm also on just with my name on all the social media feeds, which I kind of go like I'll like bombard social media for like a week or so, and then I'll just be like, I'm not doing this for like a week and a half. So I'm kind of in the not doing it phase at the moment, but I'm sure I'll be back soon enough. So I'm not hard to find though.
And it's worth shouting out that the Wine Enthusiast has more content for a site which is free to access than I think any other wine resource around. It's remarkable that it's still free to access, and what a huge service for the wine community.
Yeah, and they're posting, web stories all the time. They're doing a great job of spreading that coverage around. I'm reviewing like 200 or 300 wines a month right now. All that stuff is going up there for people to see. So yeah, it's that's a good place to see what I'm up to, what the Central Coast is up to. Yeah, I'd even like to do more web stories too. I just gotta find the time to do them. So
Awesome. Cool. Well, thank you so much, Matt, for taking a little time out of your Wednesday to join me. And thank you, everybody who watched. I'll be back in 2 weeks. I'm going to have my brother Danny on. I get to talk about like the early days with my dad in the wine business and the beginnings of Vineyard Brands and all that. And then also dive into some of the art that he's doing now. So that's it. Thank you all for joining. Thank you again, Matt. And I will see everybody in 2 weeks.
thanks, Jason. It was fun.
Bye.
Bye.